Minutes past the join time. I'm going to get started in the interest of time. So I want to say good morning and thank you for joining the Greenest City Grants info session for the 2025 cycle. As you might already know, these grants are looking to support community-driven initiatives that help to advance climate action with a focus on the city's two climate plans, which are the Climate Emergency Action Plan and the Climate Change Adaptation Strategy, while also advancing equity in our city. And I'll share a little bit more about that in a second. So for now, I'm Tina Earhart. I'm a sustainability specialist with the city, and I've been working with the city in sustainability for over 7 years, running this program for the last year. I'd also like to begin, before we go any further, by acknowledging that the City of Vancouver's work takes place on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh nations, and they've cared for these lands and waters since the beginning of time. And as funders for climate initiatives, it's especially important that city staff acknowledge those systemic inequities that have benefited and favored some groups while disproportionately impacting cultural communities over time. And we also recognize that climate change impacts groups differently, and so we have the responsibility to address these inequities through our climate work. So the purpose of today's session is to give you a rundown of the Greenest City Grant Program and the areas it supports, and to answer some of your questions. So first, I'll provide an overview of Vancouver's climate policies, and we'll go over the supporting focus areas. And then I'll go into greater detail about the application process, the timeline, the eligibility, and the selection criteria. And then finally, we'll leave plenty of time for questions. So please feel free to put those in the chat, or you can save them until the Q&A and unmute yourself to ask. So we're going to discuss the policy context now. So the Greenest City Grant supports projects that align with Vancouver's climate policies, and Vancouver's actions to combat climate change fall under two policies. So climate mitigation, you might have heard, is about reducing carbon pollution at the source by changing or modifying activities that burn fossil fuels. And Vancouver's plan for this is the Climate Emergency Action Plan. It was adopted by Council in 2020, and it focuses mainly on reducing carbon pollution from buildings and from transportation. Climate adaptation, on the other hand, is about preparing for the hazards of climate that are already on their way, both by looking at reducing risk to these changes and by strengthening our resilience and ability to recover from them. And Vancouver has a strategy for this as well. It is called the Climate Change Adaptation Strategy, and it was first adopted by Council in 2012. And it was last updated in spring of 2024. It's important to note that climate change disproportionately impacts different groups, as I've mentioned before. So both of our climate plans are rooted in equity and justice. And you might know that the city has an equity framework that guides our efforts, and this is helping us to ensure that climate action can improve the quality of life for all Vancouver residents, including those who are in disproportionately impacted populations. So what that means is that those that are facing the greatest impacts are represented in the program development, and the benefits of our climate actions are felt by the communities that are hardest hit by social and economic injustices. So you're going to see equity embedded throughout these policies, and it's also the reason why we seek to support projects in the community that focus on both climate and equity. And I'll tell you a little bit more about both of these policies now. So the Climate Emergency Action Plan seeks to address the major sources of carbon pollution that are created locally. And before I tell you about the actions that we have in that plan, it makes sense to know what the biggest sources of carbon pollution are. So, according to our local emissions inventory, these are burning natural gas for heating and hot water in our buildings. Many of our homes use natural gas furnaces and hot water tanks, and so switching away from this fossil fuel can really improve our energy efficiency, and it's a big part of the transition that we need to make. The second area is burning gas and diesel in our transportation network. So the vehicles that we drive are the second biggest source of carbon pollution. And you'll note here there's also smaller shares of carbon pollution coming from waste rotting in the landfill, which we capture most of and use as renewable natural gas, and electricity, which is low because nearly all of our electricity in BC is renewable. Something that I'd also like to note here is that this inventory focuses on the forms of carbon pollution that Vancouver has authority over. So there are, of course, consumptive activities like purchasing habits and dietary choice that cause carbon pollution too, but these are the kinds of activities that are more complex to address because they originate outside of city boundaries, called Scope 3 emissions. So they require other levels of government to account for and act on. So coming back to what our plan focuses on, the Climate Emergency Action Plan has the goal of cutting carbon pollution in half by the year 2030. And the goals are broken into 6 big moves. So big move 1 is cross-cutting. It takes a look at how we plan our neighborhoods. So policy decisions can make for denser neighborhoods where cars need to be driven less and neighborhoods can be made up of greener buildings. Big moves 2 and 3, you see in red here, are focused on our transportation carbon pollution. So by improving cycling, walking, and rolling throughout the city, and by supporting electric vehicles. Then we have big moves 4 and 5 in yellow, and they focus on building carbon pollution. So both through the way that we heat and provide hot water to existing homes and through introducing better construction practices and materials. And then big move 6 is important because we also need to suck out the carbon from the atmosphere to be successful at limiting global warming, and forests and wetlands really offer natural climate solutions to help with this. So the Greenest City Grant supports projects that align with the Climate Emergency Action Plan. And to give you a flavor, here's kind of a non-exhaustive list of examples of the kinds of community-led projects that would really align well with this plan. So projects that educate and create awareness on the local causes and solutions to climate change, including those actions that residents can take. Projects that encourage active transportation and transit, electric vehicles in our city, really especially those that support equity-deserving groups in these areas. Projects that encourage a switch to renewable energy, such as heat pumps, when it comes to home heating and hot water, and also those that promote energy efficiency and those that support households that might be experiencing energy poverty, and projects that support low-carbon construction materials. So we just discussed the Climate Emergency Action Plan, but Vancouver's other climate policy is the Climate Change Adaptation Strategy. And this strategy bases its actions on responding to the major hazards in Vancouver as a result of climate change. The hazards are based on projections from global climate models, and we have data that tells us what changes we might expect in the future as a result of climate change. So this is what we're looking at on average for the 2050s. We're going to see warmer temperatures overall with more hot days and heat waves in the summer, less rain in summer and longer dry spells, more rain overall and more intense rainfall. In addition, the province of BC currently advises cities to plan for 50 centimeters of sea level rise by 2050 and 1 meter by 2100, but projections past 2050 vary quite widely. And while these projections don't include poor air quality, we know what changes we should anticipate for. There's consensus among climate scientists and public health experts and others that hotter, drier summers will mean longer and more severe wildfire seasons, leading to more wildfire smoke exposure and poor air quality days. And something I just want to note here is that this is, of course, based on a business as usual scenario, or what can happen if we don't do anything to change course. Some of these changes will be unavoidable, but their extent and the severity and our ability to be resilient depends on the actions that we can take today. So Vancouver's climate change adaptation strategy aims to reduce our risk to these climate hazards and protect people, ecosystems, and infrastructure and services from those changes that we can avoid. The strategy is based on those local climate projections I just shared, and it focuses on actions that are related to our 5 main climate change related hazards, which are extreme heat, poor air quality, drought, extreme rainfall, and sea level rise. The strategy also includes some enabling actions that help to build Vancouver's capacity through learning and collaboration and innovation. So what are some examples of what that looks like in this plan? Well, supporting and enabling cooling centers and clean air centers where people can go to be safe from extreme heat and poor air quality events. Green infrastructure measures like drought-resistant plants, as well as rain gardens that help with heavy rainfall and filter into the ground and avoid flooding. Planning and caring for our urban forests, which improves air quality and really keeps the temperature lower in extreme heat. And planning for our future shoreline with sea level rise. So the Greenest City Grant supports projects that align with our climate change adaptation strategy too. And I wanted to give you a list of some non-exhaustive examples of the kinds of community-led projects that may fit here. So projects that educate and create awareness about local climate hazards and what Vancouver residents can do to prepare themselves. Projects that support any residents that are vulnerable to any of the climate hazards, for example, programs that work to keep seniors safe during heat waves. Projects that protect and restore natural areas, because natural climate solutions like those forests and wetlands and even pollinator meadows can help lessen climate impacts like flooding. And projects that support tree planting to help with outdoor cooling and support the planting of drought-resistant species. And of course, those that support residents with information to help make their homes more resilient to climate hazards, such as cooling retrofit measures, and to be more prepared for climate emergencies in general. So our Climate Emergency Action Plan and our Climate Change Adaptation Strategy represent the city's work to transition off fossil fuels and prepare us for climate hazards. There are some additional focus areas that are not included in these plans that have a complementary focus and are eligible for grants in 2025. And that includes supporting work in the areas of sustainable food systems and waste reduction. So some examples of food and waste supporting projects could include encouraging low carbon diets, reducing food waste, supporting sustainable food production, repair and reuse initiatives, reducing and preventing food waste, and encouraging change in personal consumption of goods, foods, and packaging. So we're going to switch gears here a little bit now that we've covered Vancouver's policies and some examples of topics that are eligible for projects. I'd like to talk about the nuts and bolts of the rest of this program. So the grant has been in place since 2016, and today it funds community-driven initiatives that help advance both climate and equity in Vancouver. We receive lots more applications than we are typically able to fund. Typically, we have been able to fund about 5 to 6 projects on average per year. And the funding that is available is up to $50,000 per project. Now, your project can be 1 or 2 years in length, and the expressions of interest are due October 2nd. And if eligible, then you would be able to submit a full application, which would be due to us on December 2nd. In terms of project eligibility, the grants are designed to support place-based projects. So what this means is that they should be in and for Vancouver, and they contribute to our Climate Emergency Action Plan, Climate Change Adaptation Strategy, or the supporting areas I just covered. It is a very good idea to be able to point out the areas of our plan that your project supports and to understand those linkages. Some other things that I just want to note are that we support projects that work to reduce systemic inequities faced by disproportionately impacted groups and residents. Also projects that engage local residents around climate action and support kind of a sense of ownership when it comes to climate solutions. Projects that strengthen social connections among individuals and networks are great. And ideally, the projects would be led by equity-seeking organizations, which means hopefully your organization has some articulated commitment to equity. Your project doesn't need to meet every one of the criteria on the right of this slide, but we do like to see a focus on community, and once again, demonstrating equity is essential. So, is your organization eligible for a Greenest City grant? So we'll go over the eligibility here at a glance. These grants are for registered nonprofit societies and charities. First Nations are also eligible. If you are not one of these types of organizations, you could partner with another one of these to be considered eligible. Your organization does need to have an independent and active governing board or body composed of volunteers. As part of our commitment to equity, it should also be able to demonstrate accommodation and inclusion, or how equity factors into your organization, as I mentioned before. You need to be able to demonstrate functional capacity to deliver the project. So what that means is be able to provide at least 1 year of financial statements for your organization, and of course show that you have the capacity to deliver the proposed initiative. So who is not eligible? This grant is not for individuals. So we do have a stream of neighborhood small grants offered through neighborhood houses. They're for smaller projects of up to $500, which individuals can apply for. These grants are also not for for-profit organizations, but as said before, you could apply with a nonprofit in order to become eligible if you had a project with some kind of focus that was meeting all of the other eligibility criteria. If your project involves acquiring land or large-scale capital costs, this is off the table. And if the project is exclusively university-led research, this is also out of scope for these grants. I also have some notes here for returning applicants. I'm not sure if I've seen any in the chat who have joined here, but just in case you are a returning applicant, if you have been funded before by this grant, we only fund the same organization or project a maximum of 2 times in a 5-year period. And if you have received a grant from us before and it is not completed for the reasons of the project being delayed, your organization won't be eligible for funds again until the project is complete and we've received a final report. So we can go over some timeline details here. The grant opened on September 3rd, and the deadline for expressions, again, you might know this already, is October 2nd. You can expect to hear from us by the week of October 21st, somewhere in there, with whether or not you're invited to submit a full application. And then your full application would be due to us on December 2nd. Now, what our staff does at that point is we review in December and January to make our recommendations, and these have to be approved by council along with the city's other grants. So the council date for our grants has not been set yet, but normally it takes place in February or March, after which point we notify applicants of the outcome. So here's some more detail on the process. So as you see, there's 3 steps here. The first step is the expression of interest. So the purpose is to determine your eligibility and to save you the trouble of a full application if you're not eligible. If you haven't seen the expression of interest yet, it's a short and simple form you can download off our website and complete. There is also a guide on our website that outlines the eligibility that I just covered. That gets emailed to our email address, greenest.citygrant@vancouver.ca, before the deadline October 2nd at 5 p.m. And the second step is we'll review these and invite eligible organizations to complete a full application. The full application will ask you for your organization information, more in-depth project information, your project budget, and you'll be allowed to submit other supporting documents. Full application, again, is due to us on December 2nd at 5 p.m. You will need to email this to us as well. We'll break down the expression of interest a little bit further. So as mentioned, it is a short form. It's really just designed to help us get a brief snapshot of your project. You can download it from our website. The expression of interest asks for some very, very basic information about your project, your funding amount, and if it meets the climate and equity criteria. And there's a newly sort of added checklist that just helps us to assess some of the basic eligibility criteria about your organization and project. So it's just a series of yes, no boxes that you need to check. And once you submit it, we'll review for eligibility and let you know if you can submit a full application, or if you're not eligible, depending on the project or reason for ineligibility, we might be able to provide you with some feedback to make your project eligible to submit the full application. Now, when it comes to the full application, the purpose is really to get a bit more about your project and organization and assess the impact it would have in the community, as well as your organization's fit for the project. So on the impact side, we're looking for the extent to which your project contributes to climate action and or resilience in Vancouver. What is the potential impact of your project and how can it be scaled? And does it contribute to reducing systemic inequities experienced by residents? And when it comes to your organization, we ask a few questions to get a sense of your current role in the community and how you're connected and engaging with residents or your specific audience and how they are benefited. And of course, if you have a realistic plan and resourcing to make the project happen. So this could include demonstration of other funding sources toward the same project. This is the criteria key that we use to make decisions on the project. So I won't go into this in depth, but I am just sharing it to provide some transparency on the decision making and what we use to evaluate the applications we receive. Typically, the selection committee consists of city staff from sustainability and from social policy, and depending on the nature of the projects, we sometimes also bring in staff with expertise in other areas as well to advise. So this tells you a little bit about the full application checklist. So again, the expression of interest, which is step one, is much shorter, and you are asked not to submit additional documents when you submit that. But if you are invited to submit the full application, we will be seeking the following from you, and we'll send you all the necessary forms to complete at that stage. So one thing is the application form. We used to have this in two parts, which was an organization form and a project form. We combined that for simplicity this year. We also ask for your certificate of incorporation or documentation of being a nonprofit. We ask for a project budget. We can provide a template for this, but you can also use your own. And a recent audited financial statement or year-end statement if you don't have audited statements. We ask for your list of board of directors. And as I've mentioned, you're welcome to submit additional supporting documents at this stage, including letters of recommendation, equity or sustainability plans, and that kind of thing. But please, we ask that you do not send any of these documents at this the expression of interest stage, just so that we can manage the volume that we're receiving. So that concludes the presentation portion of this info session. We're going to head into some Q&A. So some of you sent questions in advance. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by answering some of those, and then we will see if there are more from the audience today. And I'll actually stop recording once we turn it over to the audience so that you can unmute yourself to ask questions if you like. So we'll cover this first, and then I will let you know when I've stopped recording and we can take questions from the audience. So the first question is about past projects. So if you would like to see what types of projects we fund, you can always just scroll to the bottom of our grants webpage, which is where you can see all of the projects funded up until last year. And yes, past projects have supported a range of areas. We've supported active transportation projects, those that focus on supporting residents with energy efficiency, lots of climate education projects in the past, ecological restoration, natural climate solutions. All of that is fair game. So which expenses are allowed and which are not? There are no specific requirements for expenses other than those that are laid out in the eligibility. So as I mentioned before, we cannot fund large-scale capital costs or land acquisition. We have been asked before if the grant can be spent on practical things like buying heat pumps for homes, and unfortunately, this particular expense is not eligible because it would be considered under capital costs. But things like educational workshops and support for making the switch to heat pumps are in scope. Another question that we commonly get asked in this category is, can the funding be used for staffing? And staffing costs are technically allowed as part of the project budget. However, I just want to note that since our Greenest City grant is not really designed to support ongoing organizational needs, since you know that we have the criteria that organizations can only be funded twice within a 5-year period, we don't recommend relying on this funding for your staffing on an ongoing basis. So if you're looking for funding for core operational needs, I would recommend that you explore the city's core support grants. That's something you can look up on our website. We had a question about how eligibility works with a partnership between multiple organizations. So the answer to this is we would need you to identify one organization that would act as the lead applicant, and that organization would need to apply and communicate with us. And that organization would also need to meet the eligibility criteria I've laid out in this session. So they need to be a nonprofit or charity, and they need to have financials for at least 1 year to report on, and everything else that I've mentioned. The relationship between your organizations, though, does not have to be legally binding in order to apply. So just to clarify that. Now, there was a question about how cultural diversity and racial equity factors into eligibility for the grant. So hopefully this has been answered for you throughout the session, but as you've heard in the session, we're looking for projects that advance climate goals while also advancing equity in our city. And you can demonstrate that your organization has a commitment to equity by sharing any relevant policies or by sharing how your organization is addressing equity. There will be questions that you can answer about this when we get to the full application stage. So just letting you know that. Now, this is a tricky one that we get year over year, and so it's really specific to organizations who've received funding before. So I've received a Greenest City grant before. When can I apply again? So your organization can be funded up to 2 times in a 5-year window. And the visual here is meant to show how that works. So in this cycle, we're considering grants for the 2025 year. So this means that the 5-year cycle extends back to 2021. So you can't receive more than 2 grants between 2021 and 2025. If you have a question about your eligibility or you're not sure when you were last funded, you're welcome to reach out to me, or you can contact our Greenest City grant inbox to find that out. We also had a question about whether there is language assistance for completing the expression of interest. And this is a great question. Recently, the city introduced a language access policy to establish some rules and priorities around translating materials. Obviously, we're a very large organization, so as I understand it, the priority is to start with those aspects of our work that serve the most significant number of individuals with limited English proficiency. So I've reached out to this team to understand where our grant fits into that prioritization and if subsequently they're able to provide support for this. I do want to say at this point, I don't have an answer from them yet, but since this question was asked anonymously, I would ask you to please email us at greenest.citygrant with your primary language. Let us know what your primary language is, and I can let you know what is possible once I've heard back from this team. And something else I should just note is that the application is part of participating in the grant program, but successful recipients also participate in check-ins and need to produce final reports for their work. So When you're asking for language assistance, each of these other things would also need to be considered. So that is what we need to look at if we need to find out if the city has capacity for it at the moment, is it's a full program participation, not just the one piece that you're filling out at the beginning. And the last of our prepared questions here is that we had a very specific question regarding the last question on the expression of interest, which I agree is a little bit confusing. So thank you for pointing that out. We will reword that in next year's expression of interest. The question is to please confirm your project is not seeking funding for any of the following activities, which is land acquisition and large-scale capital costs and exclusive university-led research and advocacy. So to clarify, if your project is not seeking funding for these things, you should check the yes box. If they're not seeking funding for these things, you should check the yes box. If they are seeking funding for these things, you need to check the no box. I hope that helps. And again, this will be circulated, so you should have this to reference when you're completing your application. So those are all the questions that I received in advance. So I will stop the recording for the session, and then we can see what other questions folks may have. But for those who might be listening to this recording after the fact, I just want to say thank you for watching. If you have any questions, we are here to help. Please feel free to email greenest.citygrant@vancouver.ca, and I will see what I can do to answer your question. And just a reminder that the expression of interest is a hard deadline. So if you're interested in submitting for this, please submit no later than October 2nd at 5 p.m. And I will stop recording this session now. So just one moment, bear with me.